So with that, ladies and gentlemen, the first part of our morning is over. We are now starting the presentations part of our conference. We will have these QR codes that will allow people to send questions that will arrive to us. That's for people who are here in the room, and for people who are online. Follow the link below the live stream video. The first speaker, we're absolutely delighting, Minister Khemaies, that you are here with us today. Mr. Jhinaoui Khemaies was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia and Tunisia's ambassador to Russia and the Ukraine. He's the founder of the Tunisian Council for International Relations, the strategic partner of our Center for the Greater Middle East region. And also, thank you for agreeing to affiliate with the Atlantic Council and our center as a distinguished fellow. So, Mr. Minister.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be back in Washington. I'm grateful to you, Dan, for giving me this opportunity to take part in this important debate today. I have to start with a disclaimer, however. Contrary to all the bright minds in this room, I'm no expert in political transition. My 40 years of diplomatic service did not prepare me for the complexity of the process when I was recalled in 2011 from my diplomatic assignment in Moscow to join the first post-revolution government. 60 years after the independence, most MENA region found themselves lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of political participation and good governance. The Arab Spring protest of 2011 ushered new processes that were supposed to lead to the overhaul of the outdated order in the Arab world and promote more democratic and accountable system. Situation varied from one country to the other, depending on the level of progress achieved by each country in institutional building and social and economic advancement during the post-independence years. This explains in great part why countries such as Libya or Yemen fell into endless spiral of violence and civil strife, while Tunisia and Egypt went through less turbulent transition. With weak state institution and lack of civil service traditions, Libya and Yemen were ill-equipped to sustain the aftershocks of regime change, chaos, and violence often ensued. In Tunisia and Egypt, the early phase of transition proceeded in a more orderly fashion. Both countries adopted new constitutional frameworks, elected new government immediately after the demise of the old regimes, and set in motion new reform processes. The MENA region seems nowadays perhaps more fractious and divided than in 2011. Most countries went through important transformation, but regrettably none of them can claim to have built a new representative system driven by sound government and free market principles. What went wrong? Why most of the transition failed? Unprepared and taken by surprise, after the sudden fall of the old regimes, politicians had two options in mind. One, calling for radical change, regime change, so as to break with the status quo ante and fully dismantle the old political order with no clear picture of the alternative. A second model based on a more gradualist approach called for reforms that could accommodate aspiration for democratic participation while salvaging the basic structure of the old system. 12 years after the Arab Spring, both models failed in different degrees and for various reasons to build free and prosperous society. They were saddled by mistakes of the old regimes, also lack of realism Inexperience, if not both, combined with the score settling and zero-sum game mindsets, undermined the processes. Countries that choose to sharply break with the old system failed even more abysmally. In Libya, the Gaddafi regime was forcefully removed by outside military intervention with no exit strategy in mind. The country was left to simmer in strife and growing chaos, and armed militia imposed their rules in a divided society. The weakening of an already feeble state institution made the distribution of oil revenues part of the power struggle instead of being part of the state rebuilding. The situation in Libya, in fact, showed how instability and violent strife can endanger freedom and human rights while making economic stagnation worse. No effort to improve good governance, expand freedom, or revitalize the economy can happen in a fragmented society and divided state subject to endless civil war, foreign interference, and regional meddling. Besides the disconnect between the regime and the population, Syria is still isolated and not in control of large part of its territory. The regime is merely surviving thanks to the Russian and Iran aid. All traditional economic indicators are in decline, and there is no prospect in present situation for political freedom and democracy. Tunisia, which enjoyed a period of relative economic growth until 2011, had boasted a solid tradition of civil service, was in a better position to address most of the challenges it faced after the fall of the old regime. After 2011, it elected the Constituent Assembly, organized 2 and 3 elections, and adopted a broadly based new constitution in 2014. Much has been said about the shortcomings of that constitutional text, but most of the problems which later emerged were the result of bad politics. The constitution in itself allowed for functioning institutions based on the principle of checks and balances. Lack of vision, corrupt practices, and inexperience led to the neglect of much-needed economic reforms. Socio-economic decline and social unrest eventually undermined the democratic transition. Populist narratives, which included disdain for political parties and the elite in general, eventually gained favor with the public. It all sparked skepticism about the democratic process as a whole. Liberal economic reform became synonymous with unacceptable sacrifice imposed on the poor and subservience to foreign diktats. Bureaucratic tradition was too stubborn to allow the entrepreneurial spirit to blossom. The first and most crucial lesson of the Tunisian experience is that poor socio-economic performance can lead to disillusionment with the democratic ideals, even if the majority remains attached to freedom. Countries that opted for gradual and pragmatic approach acted preemptively in addressing people's grievance had a better chance at growth and political stability. Morocco, Jordan, for example, were quick to act before and immediately after the uprising started in Tunisia and Egypt. They moved to accommodate people's demand for political and economic reforms. Salaries were increased, food and consumer prices kept in check, and new laws were adopted to improve governance, restrain monarchical powers, and reduce more transparency in managing public funds. The two monarchies broadly maintained the status quo, while introducing a set of reforms to liberalize the political system and enlarge participation in public life. Their overall overall impact remained, however, limited, as they did not lead to systemic changes in governance, more accountability, or larger participation of the local population in the political life. It is quite difficult to identify common factors that contributed to setbacks in democratic processes in the MENA region. Extrapolating from the Tunisian experience, one can mention 5 major factors. One, the neglect of structural reforms and sterile debate about identity was started as spontaneous appraising of young and employed people asking for more freedom and dignity, turned quickly into ideological confrontation about identity. Islamists who won election immediately after the fall of old regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya focused on changing the way of life of people instead of addressing the real socio-economic problems. No major reforms were introduced, and standards of living further deteriorated in most Arab countries. 2, youth and large segment of the population felt disconnected from the process. Debate was restricted to the urban political elite. Large segment of the population, and particularly young people who were instrumental in igniting the revolution, were sidelined and seldom took part in decision-making processes and public debate on issues of national concern. They felt disconnected from the whole political process. Instead of improving their lives and generating opportunity, chaotic democratic process was perceived as responsible for instability and the main cause of deteriorating life conditions. 3, people disengagement, lack of progress on reforms, and opportunism of political elite fueled disillusionment with the whole process that was translated in continuous diminishing of the turnout rate in general election and disaffection from political activities. 4, the absence of democratic tools. There were weak institutions, lack of democratic culture, overwhelming number of political parties with dwindling followers and no effective impact on political life. Misfunctioning of parliament, lacking experience and proper mechanism to perform its duty in drafting laws and controlling the executive branch. 5, foreign interference. Democratic processes in MENA region were also subject to regional and foreign interference, some willing to contribute to the emergence of democratic system in the region, provided financial and technical support to help authorities proceed with the needed political and economic reforms. These countries did not, however, go beyond the usual traditional assistance provided to foreign partners. They did not weigh the importance of their support on the fate of transition process on concerned countries and the region as a whole. I used to say to my colleagues from the European Union that the cost of supporting the Tunisian transition was much less than the cost of its failure. And there were also nefarious influence. Animated by ideological and geopolitical objectives, some tried to shape the outcome of the transition in a way that meet their national interest. Those who worry of the impact of democratization on their own stability sought to hinder the budding transition by various means. In some cases, interference further exacerbated domestic infighting and made even more difficult to reach peaceful solution. Where do we go from here? New factors crept in recent times. The ongoing war in Ukraine has given more clout to energy-producing countries, which are not synonymous of democratic countries, and affected the standards of living of the population in non-oil-rich nations. In the latter group of countries, soaring prices, persisting unemployment, and widening poverty has made life difficult. It could mean further deterioration of the political climate by boosting populist movement and limiting liberties. It also put democratization on the back burner. Major democracies nations are today more preoccupied with their own security challenges than promoting democracy abroad. Let me conclude with a positive note. Despite the present bleak picture, there were still reasons for hope in the region. Aspiration for positive change continue to drive large segment of the population. The yearning for better economic situation goes in hand with the desire for a stable and credible democratic system. You cannot delink the twin processes, whatever the financial cost or painful reforms needed. It is difficult to predict when and at what cost this will happen. But what started in December 2011 in rural town of Sidi Bouzid has sparked an irreversible dynamic for Tunisia and for the whole region. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Dan, for your kind invitation.